Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the Soil Association's webinar this afternoon, Building Your Brand in a Crisis. My name is Lee Holdstock. I work for the Soil Association Certification Limited, and I'm the Senior Business Development Manager. Just for those of you who don't know who we are, the Soil Association Certification is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Soil Association, who are a not-for-profit organisation campaigning for better food, farming and land use. We are the leading certification body for organic products in the UK, covering food products, health and beauty, textiles and forestry. And as we are a subsidiary of a charity, we operate as a not-for-profit. As part of our offer, we offer a range of business support services to our licensees. So this afternoon's webinar is just one such example of the insight and intel that we offer. So I'm joined this afternoon by David Preston, who is founder of a brand building company, The Crow Flies. David is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Marketing, and David brings a wealth of strategic marketing experience and will be helping us explore how brands are built, how they respond to unprecedented events such as the COVID-19 crisis, what can be done to ensure brands emerge strongly from crises such as these.
Here we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. Just to put a name to a face, that's me on the left. I have to say at the moment, I'm remarkably more hirsute than that. Really looking forward to my haircut. Lee explained a little bit about what we do. I think when most people think of marketing agencies, they tend to think of the output, advertising, design, digital, PR, whatever it happens to be. We're not that sort of company. We're more focused on the inputs, helping companies actually understand the foundations for their brand. So we go from market research through to sort of brand strategy, brand positioning, through to ultimately bringing things to life and visualization. So that's what we do. And that's, of course, those are going to be the threads that weave through what I'm going to share with you now. And today is about sharing best practice. But before I get going, I just want to mention a couple of contextual points. Hang on. Responding very slowly. Here we go. So the first thing is I'm going to be talking about what may sound like business as normal a little bit. We're going to be talking about building brands and understanding how you do that. We're going to be understanding about doing that within a crisis, but clearly a crisis is going on. So I don't want to come over as tone deaf towards the health crisis going on in our society. I don't want to come across as tone deaf towards businesses who are struggling at the moment, either with liquidity or just kind of like the operational supply side. Those things are incredibly relevant, but of course I'm not going to be talking about those because of the topic of the webinar. The other thing is I'm going to be talking about support and investing in your brand. I don't want anyone to infer from that it only means huge companies with really deep pockets. It's not about that at all. This is about the principles of how you support, invest in a brand and keep it front of mind. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. And there's one other thing I want to talk about in terms of a bit of a sort of caveat, if you like, and that is not being a soothsayer. Sorry, the slides have been very slow to respond at my end, so I just want to move them on. Come on, there we are. Here is Mystic Meg. And I am not Mystic Meg. I know you guys aren't Mystic Meg, but if you read some of the media, if you kind of like look at what's going on in society, you can imagine that some people really do think they are Mystic Meg. And I don't really want to fall for any of that. It's a bit of a fool's errand. I am going to share, potential future scenarios, and hopefully that will be helpful for you. But it is based in marketing science. It's based in data going back, almost 100 years now, so they're kind of like the Great Depression. It's based on case studies and real life examples of brands, and that's very important. We're not going to just go into idle opinion. I want to give you kind of like a degree of certainty. So let's talk about the topic. Crises. Never waste a good crisis is the old adage. And I want to start talking about two things really. Building your brand and building your brand in a crisis, because there's a unique opportunity, which I know sounds a bit counterintuitive, and again, shouldn't sound as if I'm being tone deaf. You can actually use this opportunity to come out stronger, and there's lots of brands. I mean, a great example is Guinness. If you look at Guinness's sort of track record through the years, it takes these remarkable steps up at times of recession, and we can learn a lot from brands like that. Let's start with the shape the shape of what's going on at the moment. Now, if you just focus on the blue boxes, the one thing you can guarantee about a forecast is that it'll be wrong. So I'm not attempting to forecast here. But all we need to concern ourselves with is the awareness that there are going to be some phases. You know, we're in lockdown, well, depending where we are, we're in lockdown and moving into emergence. There is going to be a recession. I don't think anyone's going to argue about that, because it's not just a demand side issue. There's also the supply side issues created by the requirements of the lockdown. And then there'll be a recovery. Now, it's not necessarily sequential. You know, we could find ourselves going into an emergence phase and then going back into lockdown, depending on what happens, and then, you know, going through it again. But actually, a lot of the focus that you hear about in the media is on that, and we shouldn't be worrying about that as brand builders. What we should be thinking about is, right, there are going to be these phases. How can we put ourselves in the shoes of our customers or consumers and think about what they're going through, and consequently their goals and their needs? And actually, so if you focus on the two rows here, explicit goals, first of all, these are the sorts of things that we as people and consumers can probably articulate. You know, these are the little problems to solve with the needs that we have. So when we think about our category or a category that we're buying into, these are the things that we're looking to solve by buying into that category. And there are also explicit goals going through the crisis. So for example, in lockdown, I'm sure you've all been through this. I know I did. There's that period of looking after my health and that of my family. There's that period of securing supplies, which was very well noted in this case. And then, you know, more latterly, there are finding those moments of enjoyment or distraction. And as we move into emergence, in fact, this is very topical given what was happening yesterday. You can almost see the breathing out reflex. People wanting to re-establish connection, restart socialization, probably a little bit aware that you know, economic difficulties are to come. And in that period, it'll be more about cutting the cloth to fit, prioritizing and focusing, and maybe deferring investments like holidays or a new car, or frankly, potentially worse than that, you know, food and things like that. And then finally, a recovery, probably the back end of 2021, early 2022. And I just want you to hold that as a little bit of a motif. We're going to come back to understanding these explicit goals later on, because it's something that you can be really thinking about now that will give you an advantage. And likewise, the implicit needs below that. These are the deeper set sort of orientations that people have in their lives. It's actually very complex. We could spend a whole day on it. We're not going to, but you can probably sense yourself how they've changed or how they are changing as we go through this period. You know, during the lockdown, it's one of security, wanting to wrap our arms around our family. As we move into emergence, enjoyment is a bit of a catch-all for that sort of that sense of release. There's lots of things below that, but there is a sense of, right, let's actually now kind of like breathe and move out a little bit and do some nice things which we couldn't before. As the recession comes along, it's going to be about control. It's going to be about discipline. It's going to be about either being forced to do that or that sense of obligation that we should be doing this. And then ultimately there'll be recovery. Now, these aren't singular implicit needs. There are more, but there becomes an orientation to them. And I think the important thing in a crisis is, I'm not sure the right language is here, is to say that we take a more negative slant on things, but certainly we begin to view the world through a different filter. And I'm sure that's something everyone has experienced through the period of the lockdown. And again, hold that thought, because we will come back to it. So let's go back to the topic here. Why are crises a vital time for brands? Respond slides, please. Lee, could you move it on? It's not responding to me. There we go. Right. You'll see there are two parts to this. There's building a brand and there's in a crisis. Let me talk about the crisis first of all. The physical crisis is, you know, what's going to happen economically, commercially, and there are other issues at play there. Just want to briefly talk about the other dimension to a crisis, which is the mental crisis of, and this is not just about mental well-being, albeit it's good that that is talked about now, but it's also the crisis in confidence that comes with something like this. And if you are a brand builder, this is a really important consideration, because you've got two plates to spin in a crisis. You've got the plate of the short term, you know, securing operations, making sure supply stays in place. That's been particularly prevalent this time. And then there's the other plate, which is the medium to long term case making for why we actually need to continue to support and invest in a brand. And I'm going to come on and talk about this in more detail, but that can be very difficult. And often it can feel like when marketing is kind of like in the corner because we don't really have the evidence. Well, I'm going to try and give you some of the evidence today for why brands thrive when they continue to support through a crisis. And here's what the opportunity is in a nutshell. Now, I'm going to call it the triple whammy opportunity. That is not the sort of the technical name for it. And it can be a triple whammy either negatively or positively, depending on what you do. Let's consider the first whammy. The first whammy is if you make a decision not to support a brand, or if you're an unsupported brand. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that there is actually lots of evidence to show that there's little short-term effect. So, 6 to 9 months in, you can imagine the finance director, and apologies if there are any finance directors here, but you can imagine the finance director kind of like rubbing their hands with glee, saying, well, told you all along, it knew it would have no effect, and indeed it hasn't. And that's because there's actually, very little short-term effect of pulling your brand. Brands don't kind of like get forgotten overnight. And so it's not surprising that there's little short-term effect. But all of the case studies, all of the data shows that you get to sort of like a year, 9 months to a year, and then beyond. And that's when the issues arise, when you're not supporting your brand, because that's when the memory is beginning to forget the touch points of a brand. And at the same time, the second whammy, brands that continue their support or support more, they too don't get a short-term benefit, which can make it look like a little bit of a dodgy episode in the first 6 months. But the truth is, and we see this from the data, that sort of 9 months and beyond, 12 to 18 months, that's when they begin to take a step forward in terms of share of mind, and ultimately commercial success as well. Now, the triple whammy opportunity is a consequent effect of those two things. The triple whammy is the first thing that happens when a crisis comes along is that brands cut investment. So if you continue to support, you get a disproportionate benefit by, frankly, having a louder voice by doing nothing. So that's one thing. So you gain in absolute terms. If you then decide to overinvest, you get an accelerator effect, a scaling effect. And that has a marked advantage to brands that continue to support. So that, in a nutshell, is the kind of the actual crisis opportunity. If you unsupport, if you don't support your brand, you in time get forgotten. And those brands that continue to support stay front of mind, and they have the opportunity to build faster. Now, the other side of the question, I said building your brand in a crisis. The other side of the question is building your brand. Now, forgive me, first of all, if I just talk about a bit of a marketing 101, but it's important. Because it's important to see how brands get responded to in a crisis. So the first thing is, in this day and age, you get lots of people saying, we live in advanced consumer societies. People are savvy enough to deconstruct brands and just buy based on some form of value. Now, I mean, if you actually observe your own buying behavior, you'll know that's not the case. And if it was, all brands would appear like the two squares here. They'd all be exactly the same. And we know that that is not the case. Because the truth is, a brand has a frame around it. And that frame is made of all the great stuff that you guys do. It'll go from the name and the logo through to any communication that you put in place, through the quality of the distribution, the experience you deliver, your social media following, whatever it happens to be. All of those apparent intangibles go into making the frame of a brand. And that's why two brands are actually different. At their heart, they've got a product, which you could argue is very, very similar, but their frames are very different. Now, the crucial thing is, if you think back to that first slide, the shape of the crisis. In a crisis, people's explicit goals and implicit needs change. The way they view the world changes. Generally, there's a little bit more stress, and people view the world through a different lens. And the same is true, therefore, for the way they view our brands. The brand frame changes, whether you do anything or not. In the current crisis, it's changing because there have been disrupted supply lines, for example. You go out to buy Andrex and you end up with Cushell or private label, and you find out, they still do the same job. But they might also be affected because one brand supports more effectively than another, or brands cut their support, and the brands are less prevalent that cut their support than the ones who continue. So a crisis is a real opportunity in a quieter environment from a brand point of view to make a disproportionate impact. And the job of a brand at any time, I think, is to manage how it's seen. But it becomes particularly important at a time of change such as a crisis. Now, the important thing is, and this bit, I'm just talking about the why. I'm going to move on to the what shortly. But why does this happen? Why does this, kind of like the brand frame change so much when you get the sort of thing like this going on? Now, everyone will have their own example of this. How do you work out how the brand frame is changing when the world is saying to you, everything is going to change? Here's the BBC, coronavirus, the month, everything changed. Coronavirus will change the world permanently. Here's how. This is all very interesting. It's also total nonsense. And the reason it's nonsense, we can, that's not just an opinion. We go back to the data and we look at Preston. I want to give you some examples of why this happens first of all. And it's down to all the sort of like the little ticks and rules of thumb that our brain uses to make sense of the world. And this is important for understanding how brands are built in a crisis. So I'll link that theme through. Let's just think of these headlines at the moment. What's going on? Human beings have a tendency to have this present bias, but a disproportionate weight on the here and now. So we tend to take what's going on right now and extrapolate it forward. So you get people saying, the future is going to be like today, even though it's totally different from the past. You can get a focusing effect where people put kind of like an odd weighting on things. They actually look at certain aspects of the situation and they say that's the important bit and that's not important. They extrapolate that forward. And the problem is they're not taking a holistic view and it's not going to be true. And then finally, there's something, the phrase wishful thinking. Well, that's actually kind of like the common name for optimism bias. And that's a tendency to, take a worldview of the future that's based on our desires in the here and now. And, so examples of that might be, we know that plant-based eating and veganism is growing, but if you're kind of like an ardent vegan, for example, you might be looking at this as a great opportunity for people to convert to veganism because of the wet markets and all of that. Now, we know there's a positive trend there, so we can expect that to continue after the pandemic crisis. But would we see a big step up? No, it's based on people's worldviews. And more prosaically, if you're now working from home, whereas before you were going into an office, and if you're now home baking, you're probably going to predict that we don't need an office in the future. And my God, we don't even need to buy bread. Now, I know I'm being kind of like making maybe silly little examples, but that is the sort of thing that we see in the headlines. And it's really important not to get distracted by it, because the truth, I'm afraid, is much more boring than this. Let's look at some examples. This is the Olympic Games. Now, you might be aware that the Olympics, one of their objectives is to increase sports participation in the host nation and beyond. And let's look at the quote at the top, which comes from the agency appointed by the IOC in reviewing that objective. The findings of this research indicate little evidence for positive, stable, long-term sports participation benefits from staging the Olympic Games. And the data supports that as well. If you look at the little blue chart on the left-hand side, you can see the step up when the Games was happening and that rush of enthusiasm. But then you can see what's called the regression to mean. It's going back to the levels it was at before. And there are little swings and roundabouts with different sports, but generally sports participation is in long-term decline and the Olympics doesn't change it, sadly. You look at other examples. This chart shows market shares of UK retailers. The line at the top is Tesco. You'll note it starts on January 15, and actually I'm going to refer to Horsegate, which was in 2013. I couldn't get the data to go back that far. But back then people were saying, oh, this is terrible, we're going to boycott Tesco. But what we know is that Tesco are in relatively long-term, ever so slight decline, as you can see there. And the vast majority of that is accounted for by the growth in the discount retailers, not in Horsegate or anything else for that matter. And likewise, you can look at something like BSE. The green line through the middle here is UK meat consumption. The little yellow shaded bit is roughly the period of the BSE crisis. And you can see that even during the BSE crisis, meat consumption, and it's actually specifically red meat, meat consumption was growing. And it actually accelerated in the noughties before the sort of like mature Western market sort of changes at the present day. But people were saying this is the age of vegetarians, we're all going to give up beef, and it's just not true at all. And then finally, a very, very recent example. This was actually from 2 days ago. From this guy Tom Goodwin, who's like a marketing influencer. Yeah, and then what he's saying here is true. The headlines were all travel will never be the same again. People stuck on cruise ships, out on, kind of like in Japanese ports, scarred by the experience. Well, Carnival, one of the world's biggest cruise operators, put orders back on their website 2 days ago. It immediately crashes because of the number of bookings coming through. Yeah, I'm afraid that actually, if people understood that human behavior is characterized more by relative stability over time. It doesn't make good headlines, but it's much closer to the truth. And if as a brand builder, you can keep this in your mind, it allows you to plan while others are panicking. But the real power of it is understanding why it happens. And it's down to the way we're wired. Now, you might have heard of System 1, System 2. You might indeed know a lot about it. Forgive me if that's the case, but let me briefly explain. Most business thinking is predicated on System 2, so on the right-hand side. And this is, rational. We are rational human beings. We make comparative decisions. We think about things slowly. We reflect on them. We weigh up the pros and cons, and then we make our decision. It's conscious. It's slow. It's very effortful. If you think about a time that you were maybe studying, and you had to consciously get facts and figures into your brain, it's hard work. You feel like your brain is slowing down to actually get this stuff into your mind. And that's what a lot of business thinking is on. That's what a lot of marketing thinking is on. But I've just put the source there. You might have read Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, they won the Nobel Prize for this thinking in behavioral economics. And what they basically said was, that does happen. Decisions like that do happen when they're meaningful life events. But most decisions, most of the time, are on the autopilot. And the way to think about this is, all the everyday decisions that you have to make. If you think about all of the individual pieces of data that you actually have to deal with over the course of the day, not things like advertising. There are hundreds of pieces of data for advertising, I know, but all the other things. How are you going to get a car? How are you going to get to work? Car, public transport, walk, bike. What are you going to eat? If you actually had to use System 2 for all of those, you would grind to a stop. We wouldn't be able to work. In fact, what goes on, they're in our autopilot. We know how they work. We've got little habits. We've got routines. We use those. It's unconscious. It's associative. It's fast. It's intuitive. And it's very decisive because the brain is thinking, this isn't important enough to spend lots of time on. I'm not going to be in danger. I'll just make this decision. Now, why is that relevant to brands? That is the question. Well, the reason is that well-supported brands get into System 1. Yeah, they have got a habit of purchase behavior. It's not necessarily big brands. It's just brands that are front of mind. They are the ones that are considered when one of your consumers or customers is in your category making a purchase. Now that sounds, all very bad for if you're a new or a challenger brand, and I'm sure there are plenty here listening today. But of course, during a crisis, it's a real opportunity. It's not going to be all status quo. We've got, had weeks of enforced lockdown. We've got subsequent months of social distancing, and there are new opportunities for habits to be formed. We are being forced in a way into using our System 2 kind of like processes in our brain when we wouldn't have otherwise done, how to stay healthy, how to home educate the kids, whatever it happens to be. And so there's actually an opportunity and a crisis on both sides here. Your ultimate goal as a brand builder is to get into System 1, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to build your brand if you're kind of like new or up and coming or a challenger. And at the moment, those System 2 decisions are probably more than 5%. We can't put a number on it, but they probably are. The important thing is, though, keep it in balance. Don't fall into kind of like the headline way of thinking, which is everything's going to change, because it's not. Use what's going to be consistent and the same as your opportunity. Now, I'm going to just flip now. I'm going to start talking about, okay, well, what should we do here? And the really interesting thing is, it doesn't matter where your brand is, which part of the brain it's processed by, System 1 or System 2. The actions you've got to take are actually the same. The creativity you use and how you show up in marketing are going to be very different, but the actions are the same. Let's talk about those. And there are really three things that you need to be focused on. Really now, as you begin to plan how you're going to get through the rest of this and then come out the other side stronger, there are three big questions. And in fact, I would contend that these are three big questions you've got to be thinking about at any time. Question one, are we focused on getting new customers all of the time? I shall say more about that very shortly. New customers all of the time. Secondly, are we getting noticed? Are we getting on the mental shopping list? Sometimes it's easy to stop when you win a point of distribution. Well, I'm afraid that's less than half of the battle. How do you move from a distribution point to a prominence point? Well, again, we'll talk about that. And then finally, and this is how do you make this happen, are we doing a few activities that matter? Now, this will be the rest of the presentation. Now, let me just deal with these three things in turn. First of all, are we focusing on getting new customers? Now, the reason for mentioning this is that it's become very fashionable to talk about micro-targeting and, kind of like TV is dead, digital is the future. And of course, we're also talking to the organic movement, aren't we? We're thinking about the organic movement, and it's very easy to justify our consumers are different, our market is different, our consumers are value-led, other consumers aren't really bothered about what they buy. Now that's all very well, but that's really boxing yourself into a corner. And you've got to be thinking, how do we get new customers? Because if you're going for a niche, you can guarantee a big brand can sweep up that niche without even thinking about it. You are competitively prone. So if we start by actually making what might seem a really obvious statement, but brands are built because consumers develop a habit of buying them to solve specific goals. So the habit is moving from disruption, system 2, into system 1. But you'll notice as well, to solve specific goals. At the same time, you've got to increase your reach. Now, I've put the reference at the bottom. You might have read this book. If you haven't, I would recommend it. Byron Sharp, How Brands Grow. It's 10 years old now, but it actually challenges a lot of conventional marketing thinking. It's very an interesting read. And what he basically shows is that it doesn't matter whether brands are big or small. Broadly, their loyalty, and he means frequency, but that frequency of purchase, is actually broadly the same. Big brands, it's slightly more. But what's markedly different is the size of the customer base. And that's how you actually become a bigger brand, by getting more users, not by finding a niche and then trying to get people to buy more. Because frankly, people who are really loyal anyway are probably maxed out. They probably can't buy much more. So it actually becomes a situation where you can't really grow. The third thing is you've got to be prominent and get noticed. And actually, this is what I was talking about before. The distribution battle isn't won when you win a distribution point. It's won when you're prominent, when literally your brand and your product is shouting from the shelves and pulling people towards it. It's winning when its message is cutting through. The fourth thing to say is, please don't fret about USPs. Because this is the thing that people talk about with marketing. Oh, it's about finding your USP. Well, if you think about it, it's incredibly difficult to find a unique selling point in this day and age. There's so much fast copying. We've got an oversupplied marketplace because we're in a mature market. If you're in tech, where you can probably have a greater chance of uniqueness, people can copy you incredibly rapidly, as we can consistently see. So don't tie yourself up in knots in that. I mean, definitely focus on a point of difference. But even a point of difference is just one of the foundations of what you really need, which is distinctiveness in the marketplace. So differentiation and distinctiveness is what you need. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And then finally, I'd like everyone to sort of disabuse themselves of the notion that attitudes lead behavior. There's actually very little sort of, marketing science data or scientific data that supports that. There are always cases. There are definitely cases in the organic movement who are people who are very values-led and make decisions based on that. And you'll probably think that about yourself. I do in certain categories. But for most people, for most of the time, for most categories, and this is the important thing, it's the other way around. Behavior drives attitude. Actually, using a product makes people think differently about it. Using it repeatedly creates the purchasing habit and actually creates greater liking. So that's the first question. Let's talk about the second question. And this was, are we getting onto the mental shopping list? Now, this single page is a whole day's conversation, so I'm going to really distill it right down. What's the heart of a great brand? At the heart is fusing the message and the memory. What do I mean by that? Message is what people think of as positioning, the single-minded statement that the brand owns in the mind of its target audience. And that still holds true to this day. Great brands do stand for something that's clear and unambiguous. And I think a real test of a brand is when the brand's customers or consumers can answer these 4 questions. What the brand is. It sounds really basic, doesn't it? But you'd be amazed the number of times in research people say, well, I'm not quite sure. It does a bit of this and a bit of that. What the brand is, what the goals are it fulfills, how it is used, and how the brand is better. They're really simple, basic questions, but they are the words. And I think a lot of brand builders kind of like worry a lot about the words, and they don't worry enough about the memory structures, like the assets, that are owned in people's minds, the non-written assets, the things that actually recall the brand when they're just seen. So visual cues, verbal cues like strap lines, jingles, well, hey, good old 1970s, but they work. And then the experiential cues, very important in the organic sector, the consistency of the usage experience, how it feels, how it looks, how it smells. You only need a small palette of those because you want to be investing in them. And I'll say more about that in a bit. And then the third question, are you focusing on activities that matter? There is a bit of an adage in marketing, and you might well have heard it, and people say, oh, the majority of innovation fails. What is never mentioned is that the majority of brands fail. And that's the truth of it. The majority of brands fail. And the reason that many brands fail is because they attempt to do way too much stuff. Too many messages with not enough investment. Too many activities with not enough investment in time and focus. Too many different messages. Too much chopping and changing. Great brands focus on the activities that matter. Now, I said at the start about one of the caveats is this isn't a webinar for big brands with really deep pockets. These principles apply whoever you are at whatever life stage you're at. And I think one of the big things in this day and age is there's a bit of a false prophet around digital about digital means that we can actually reach lots of people for very little money, and actually we can find this kind of like this core of users, a small core who are going to be incredibly loyal, are going to get the brand tattooed on their buttocks or whatever it is. My apologies, I don't mean to be flippant. I mean, the truth is most brands that you and I consume are brands that have been created by some form of mass marketing in a savvy way. And mass marketing is big activities that impact the marketplace. And if you actually think about how big brands are built, it doesn't have to be because of deep pockets. You think of brands like Brewdog. I mean, they did a number of outrageous PR exercises, you would argue, including driving a tank to the House of Commons and various other things. But you cannot argue with the success that they drove off the back of it. Now, arguably, this was all aligned to their credo, so they had a real clear sense of direction. But they built themselves through creativity. If you look at a brand like Emily, I love this example. This is just from a few weeks ago. They booked media. And then the pandemic came along, so they had all of these sort of like 6 sheets, and no one to see them. Our first ever poster seen by one runner and a pigeon, and I love it. But of course, what happened is they got amplification effect from that because they went all over the digital media with it, which is great. It can be creativity in product design. Loads and loads of examples, loads in the organic sector. We've seen so many at the Boom Awards in recent years, but a classic example is Dyson, iconic in so many different ways. But I mean, colour, the dual cyclones, all sorts of things. And these, are such important investments that kind of like are disproportionately big in the marketplace. And my favourite one, this is a very personal example, you probably never even heard of it, are BAM socks. BAM socks, they're made from bamboo. They are more sustainable. I'd never heard of them until I got a free pair in the post. I'm now on my 6th free pair in the post, but I have actually bought some and they're very good. But the point is, it's an act of creativity that gets the brand noticed. Advertising and digital actually reinforce, remind and reassure people about the brand and keep it front of mind. So a crisis is an opportunity both for creativity, but also for reminding people. And you've got to spin those two plates depending whether you're sort of system 1 or system 2. So let's talk about the activities that matter. There are 5 things that I want to talk about now. I'll talk about them quickly because a lot of them are for now. A lot of these are getting the foundations in place right now so you can come out stronger. So they're unlocking the insights that matter, broadening the consumer base that you are focusing on, or the customer base, depending on your market, building your brand to create a tornado effect. This is about message and memory. Writing a brand plan for impact. I've got a passion about brand plans. Hopefully that'll show in a minute. And finally, 3 essential tasks. I would argue there are 3 essential tasks that any brand, anywhere, should be doing, nothing else. So one slide on each of these. Let's talk about insights first of all. Insights, sadly, is one of those words that's been messed around with. It's a bit of a strategic amplifier used to make someone sound clever. And for someone who's cleverer, they will then say it's not insight, it's foresight nowadays. It's all nonsense. I mean, if you actually think about insights as any information that has the potential to determine the best way to proceed, that's what ultimately we're looking for. Insights are vital. They force you to put yourself in the shoes of your consumer or customer. They force you to stay consistent to answering goals and needs, and they have incredible value. So let me talk about 5 things here that you could be thinking about. Now, first of all, first 2 of these go back to that first chart, explicit goals. If you think about your brand in its category, there are different ways that people come into that category for different needs. And what I would say right now, while you have some, hopefully, time on your hands, is list all of the category entry points. What are they? They might be tensions. They might be little prosaic problems to solve. I've listed some examples of here. You don't have to get too kind of like scientific about it all, but just list them out and then force rank them. Which are the most important in your category? My background is in the drinks industry, and frankly, in alcoholic drinks, if you don't offer refreshment and you don't offer some semblance of taste, you don't win at all. In fact, you don't even get to the table. So you'll know what they are for your category, but list them. And then look at your competitors and say, do your competitors own any of these goals, that they're solving these goals? And if they don't, nab them. Refocus your efforts on winning against the big tasks in your category, because that's why people are buying it. They've got a task to fulfill, and you need to know what those tasks are, and you need to know that your brand is fulfilling it. Related to that are the implicit needs. This is quite a big, complex topic, but ultimately there are about 8 implicit needs that brands can build up. And you need to know what the kind of like the needs orientation is for your brand and what it delivers again for most of the time. A crisis gives an opportunity to access at different points, but your brand might be about enjoyment, it might be about adventure, it might be about control. But now is the time to do some work on that. The third thing is, you might have an insight, or you might be looking for an insight. It has to be strategically fertile. And the amount of time that people talk about, we've got to ask 5 why questions and dig deeper, and they come up with an insight that you just can't use. I love the example of Marmite. Marmite could have talked about taste, health, micronutrients, the fact that it's vegetarian. They could have talked about so many things, but they talk about a user attitude. People love it or hate it. And they've used that for 2 decades to bring that brand to life, both in terms of its advertising, but its innovation pipeline, its social presence. And it's a funny one, isn't it? You can think, well, we're only talking to half the market at best. Yet everyone's got a point of view, and lots of people use it in a light way. Related to that is your insight has to be able to amplify the brand. A personal example, and my apologies if anyone here is into craft beer, because I launched Coors Light in the UK in 2003. And the positioning of that brand is a beer that is as cold and refreshing as the Rocky Mountains, which is where it was first brewed. And so the big goal of that category is refreshment, as I mentioned. Now, when we launched it, we put a new technology on for the sector, which was called thermochromic ink. Basically, it's ink that changes color when the temperature changes. And in this case, it moves from gray when it's warm to blue when it was cold. Now, any drinks brand can do that. Whether you're in a bottle or a can, anyone can do that. But Coors Light used it to amplify its central positioning, built off its explicit goal of refreshment. And now it uses it across the world and has used it to great success. And then finally, I'd say, don't believe all the pseudoscience around insights. You should actually be able to identify the insights for your category and your brand. You should have a list of contenders. You need to choose one. Don't spend all of your time worrying about definitions. It should be third. A third of the time finding the insight, a third of the time bringing it to life, expressing it for the business and your customers, and then the rest of the time using the damn thing. That's the most important thing about insight. It should unlock action. The second big action is broaden who you focus on. So reach out beyond a narrow niche. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, this is a bit of a complicated chart, but let me just break it down very simply. I'm not going to go into the detail of it. Across the horizontal axis is targeting based on attitude. This was work done for Soil Association actually a few years ago, looking at organic consumers. And we found 6 prevalent attitudinal orientations. So we're not talking about millennials. We're not talking about 18 to 29-year-olds. We're not talking about B, C1. We're not doing any of that. That doesn't help you. We're talking about attitudes. You can be any age but share a common attitude. Down the vertical axis, you've got explicit goals and implicit needs. Now, the point of this chart is to say we don't have one person who is the same all of the time. People have different attitudes and different needs, often in the same category. If I think of yogurt, I buy indulgent yogurts with kind of like, fruit compote, and I buy light yogurts maybe for the morning. I buy thick yogurts for cooking with, and I'm all the same person, yet I probably only target consumer for one of those. So it's much more fluid and much less set than you would imagine. So the important thing is when targeting is, yes, you've got to be clear on who you think your heartland consumer is and who is at the bullseye of your brand. But just, if not more important, is who are the people who are maybe the moderate users who could become my heavy users? And beyond that, who are the people who could be the light users of my brand? They're just as valuable because there'll be many, many more of them. So I'm not saying target everyone and fragment your effort down. You can't do that. You need targeting of your communications and your focus, but you've got to be conscious of who your source of business is and make sure you don't lose them. The third action is this brand tornado. That is not something I'm trying to trademark. It's actually literally the effect of a tornado. You know, you're sucking in people at the top of your brand and you want to release as few of them as possible at the bottom. And the way to do that is by coming back to this notion of message and memory. You want the words that you use, your positioning, to be single-minded and to meet the goals of the category. You want your memory structures to do the same. You want 3 or 4 memory structures, no more, unless you're a mega brand, no more, because you want to be investing in them. And those memory structures, the visuals, the experience, the design, whatever it happens to be, they too should cue the goals that you're looking to fulfill from your category. If you can do that with both sides of this, you get this sort of extreme vortex effect. This is when you see brands really gaining momentum in society. This is a really big opportunity in a crisis because the competitive landscape quietened down. You get lots of people removing their investment. If you can continue to invest, you can really step forward because of this. The fourth action is brand planning. Gosh, what a dull topic. And you know, people, I think, often think brand plan is just a common sense task, and yet most brand plans fail. Most of the activities specified in brand plans don't happen, and the reason is that because brand plans fail to unite, they fail to align, they fail to inspire, and it's such a shame. And it's because of some basic things. And what I would say is, right, your brand plan process, whatever it is, whatever it looks like, should broadly resemble this in shape. The words aren't important here, but the shape is important. It should be very wide at the top. You should be listening to lots of people in the business, outside the business. You should be getting lots of sources of data. But then you need to be crushing them down ruthlessly to 2 or 3 golden threads of insight that flow all the way from the top through to the executional activities that you land in the marketplace. So that's the top half, the sort of like this real filter. At the bottom, and by the way, proportionately, it's too big, but just to give you the sense of it, at the bottom, you need to be doing 2 or 3 activities on a brand in a typical financial year. Any more than that, you are setting yourself up for failing. I think what happens in brand planning is people start to talk about prioritization. And I'll tell you now, prioritization is wrong. You don't need to prioritize, you need to sacrifice. You shouldn't be having conversations about, I'll put a little bit less money on this. You should be having conversations which are, I'm not going to do that at all in order to free up the maximum amount of investment to get this away. Because if you link this all the way back to system 2 and system 1 thinking, if you're a challenger brand, you've got to get noticed. The way you get noticed is by making really effective activities with as much investment as you can muster. And that really brings me to my last action, which is there are 3 essential tasks and they link to this plan. You know, I think at any stage that a brand is at, whether it's 20 years old or 2 months old, you should be thinking about these 3 things. The first one is mental availability. You want your brand to be available not just on shelves, but in the mind. How do I land my message and the memory structures that are working with it with as much scale, consistency, and impact as I can muster? And so often it's, we'll do a bit of this, a bit of that, some posters, a bit of digital, whatever it happens to be. Think about it as well with, if you're a relatively small brand with relatively low budgets, again, think about how can I ensure I don't fragment my effort? That's the key thing here. Don't fragment your effort. Really lean your shoulder into a few things and do them with as much scale as possible. Absolutely umbilically linked to it is physical availability. So if I'm going to make the brand more available in the mind, how do I make it available enough in the real world? And again, I'd say move beyond distribution points to presence points. I win the point of distribution, and then I've really got to make it sing. Secondary display, shelf edge packaging, merchandising, whatever it happens to be. And the link between the 2 of them, the bridge, is trial. I think a lot of brand managers think trial is something you do in the first 18 months of a brand's life. No, you do it throughout the whole of the brand's life. You have to recognize that, I think, that memory recedes, people forget about brands, and that's why brands that continue to invest win through a crisis. They stay front of mind. They nurture, they reinforce, and they refresh the memory structures that people have got of them, and they give themselves more chance of being bought. So that is largely me. I think the final slide is just to summarize that. If you go back to the sort of stages of a crisis, and yes, there will be some toing and froing, but we're in lockdown, we're moving to emergence, there's going to be a recession, demand and supply side recession. It's probably going to be short but very intense, and there's going to be a recovery. And if you remember, the key thing for you to be thinking about as a brand builder is, what are the explicit goals and the implicit needs that are affecting my consumers that I can work against, that I can build my brand off as the crisis happens. So get your foundations in place now. If you get the chance to go back through the slides, have a look at them. It's these things around being clear on the message and the memory structures, and really building that in terms of the actions of reaching as many customers as possible, not being too micro-targeted, pushing your distribution beyond points of distribution to presence points, and then using trial in its broadest sense to either connect people, if you're a System 2 brand at the moment, or reconnect people with a purchasing habit around your brand. So that is me. Thank you for listening. I have included my contacts in here in case anyone wants to follow up after the webinar, but I think we've got some time for questions now. If I just flick on. Lee, I'll hand back to you.
Lovely, thank you very much, David. Really important information there, some fundamentals, and of course, incredibly helpful to get such great inspiration, and to give everybody who has a brand, is involved in branding, a real sense of where to refocus in this time of uncertainty. So thank you very much. As David said, we do have a little bit of time for question and answer now. I would ask if you could kindly use your chat function, so we don't have to have a lot of background noise from people's microphones. And if you'd like to type your questions in the chat function, David and I will pick those off, and we'll do our best to answer those. So yeah, any questions from any of our audience for David, or indeed for the Sword Association? We'll just give the audience a little bit of time there, David, to type those questions in, and they should start coming through.
I'm loving the stunned silence.
Of course, if there are no questions, of course, we'll have to assume that you have you've communicated those pieces so incredibly well that there is nothing left to need to know. So we'll give the audience a little bit more time. Right, David, yes, we've got a question. Wondering what the longer term view is for organic post the crisis. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah. It's funny, actually. I think actually I put some of this in the blog I wrote for you guys a while ago. Really interesting that in 2008-9, if you think of like the last 15 years of performance for organic, I think from memory, it's been in growth for 12 of those 15. And the interruption was 2008-9, and the 3 years that followed, I think 2009, 10, 11, I think from memory. And if you think back to organic back then, it was a very woolly construct. I was actually involved in organic, but I was actually working with a major retailer on the category at the time. And one of the things they were wrestling with is, as they came out of the recession, that consumers got relatively easy things like gluten-free or healthy living or whatever it happens to be, but they couldn't quite pinpoint organic. And I think that's why the work in the last few years of actually getting organic down to a much smaller set of clearer and consistent benefits that I know that both Sword Association, the Organic Trade Board, and indeed lots of brands are now beginning to use, is vitally important. So I do think organic as a movement is in a significantly better place than it was the last financial depression. I still think there's work to be done, I still think the movement could be more single-minded. I still think every single brand in organic should actually be making sure that they don't assume that the organic credentials on their pack are just known about, but they should shout about them more, because it's a brilliant shorthand for lots of people, not just who want to live sustainably, but for lots of people who want to live healthily. So yeah, definitely in better shape. But of course, any category is made up of its brands. So a lot of organic success is down to the success of the brands that make it up. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, if that's not too woolly an answer.
No, David, and that's great. But what about local food? Do you see any changes in prospects? It feels as if people are drifting back to the supermarkets after an initial flurry of searching out their local retailers. Any thoughts on the prospects for local? Is that any different?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating, because clearly people have used farm shops, for example, because those farm shops have very, very quickly come up with fantastic solutions to meet the need. I mean, you've got to imagine some of those farm shops will probably pull away from doing it in the way they've done it through the crisis. But I think what we can't forget is that, as well as the innovation in that sort of sector with farm shops and others like it, supermarkets have been incredibly innovative too. And you've got to think particularly online shopping, which I think from memory was around about 15% of supermarket purchases. It might be a bit high. Now, it's gone up as far as 30% or 32%, I think it was, for Tesco. So I would imagine that that's going to make a bigger marked change. But I do think that more people are going to add into their repertoire local shops and buying more local produce. But bear in mind, of course, it's on an upward trend anyway. So whether that is going to be accelerated by the crisis, I'm not so sure. And I don't know whether, how much of the crisis you could pull out in terms of explaining that, but it's definitely on the up.
Fantastic, and great question here, David. I guess it's one of those questions that we all wonder when we're stood in a trade show. What about the value of trade stands and shows? Any thoughts on, is that a good way to build your brand and get visibility, or do you have any particular thoughts on trade shows?
I think the answer to that is it depends on your sector and your audience. If you're B2B and it's a very significant trade show, then it's a worthwhile investment. I've done them myself. I've benefited from them, because my audience is obviously B2B. From a consumer point of view, it's a bit more difficult because it's such a fragmented market. I mean, in the UK, the biggest food show, for example, sorry to go on about food, but the biggest food show is probably BBC Good Food, and it's a massive show, but as a proportion of the total population, it's tiny. So yeah, careful investment. Be very clear of your audience, the needs of that audience, and then you can look back and say, right, if these are the explicit goals of my audience, does the trade show fulfill that? Definitely more, I think, relevant for B2B than B2C overall.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. So you mentioned the brand shouldn't get bogged down in the what's my USP question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how brands do differentiate their products with competitors?
Yeah, great brands are built on a product truth, but the product truth doesn't have to be unique. So what I mean by that is uniqueness assumes that if the uniqueness is known, then that brand cannot be matched. And there are just so few examples of that happening. I mean, if you think food and drinks, it's virtually impossible. But you can own differentiation in someone's mind. My old category is drinks. They're all offer broadly the same thing, but the brand. I mean, a good example would be Peroni. It's a totally average beer. Sorry, anyone from, but it is. It's a totally average beer, but it owns Italian style, and that's positioning. So yeah, you want differentiation. My point is, don't overweight it. The other points of distinctiveness of a brand are just as, if not more important, in terms of actually reaching more customers. What you look like, how it cues, how it is remembered in your mind. And I think what happens is people put too disproportionate amount of focus on, I must find my USP, when actually it doesn't make a massive difference. Sounds like heresy, doesn't it?
And what about the preferred channel? Again, this might be a bit like the trade show answer again, David. I mean, is there a particular preferred channel for you, i.e., advertising, social media, or again, does it depend on the product and the category?
Sadly, it does. And I'm great. By the way, it's great people are asking specific questions, because of course those are things you need to be thinking about. But it definitely does. I mean, what you do see, I mean, particularly with digital. I see the kind of, I call them the false prophets of the digital world, because people are talking about, well, traditional media is going to be dead. And then you look at digital, and it's incredibly fragmented. So the question is, how do you actually reach anyone through digital? I'm not saying it isn't important. I use it myself for my own company, but I use it for sort of tone of voice. And I think that's the point, really. You've got to go back to, what am I trying to achieve for my brand overall? And then what do the different channels do? Some might build liking. Some might build liking, but also, get the brand, well known by many more people. And frankly, big reach channels, traditional, do that. I mean, a lot of digital case studies, the ones that are successful, one of the kind of like the success criteria is often reach. So you go, well, if people are saying digital is the new world, why are you measuring it on reach as opposed to engagement? So yeah, sorry to not be able to give a specific answer. It is on a case-by-case basis.
And we've just, I've just put a chat message out there to ask if we can get just one last question, David. And we're being asked, what do you think it would take for independent organic retailers to knock a proper punch in the market share of supermarkets? So do you think no change is likely?
Well, of course, that is a massive ask, isn't it? Because knocking a market share of the supermarkets, I mean, you probably wouldn't even spot it in the data. So, but I think if you say, right, but let's think locally. How do I make a difference here? And I think that's what it's about, by the way. I mean, I think organic has to build presence, local, and build from kind of like core marketing. You think of somewhere like Brighton, or indeed Bristol, somewhere like that. Actually build presence and just build off that base. But I think in terms of the directly answering the question, it comes back to some of the things here. An organic retailer is no different from an organic brand. You've got to be absolutely clear on your message. You've got to be really single-minded. There's just too much fanning around with too many messages, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You've got to make decisions and get focused. That's what brand building is about. If you can do that, and it's painful and it takes bravery, there's no doubt about it, but if you can do that, you have more chance of cutting through. And it's impact in the market that builds brands, not great plans. You've got to impact the market.
And finishing on that very strong statement from you there, David, I'd just like to say thank you very much to you, David, and to our audience for joining us this afternoon. If you'd like to find out more, then please do contact David at the Crowflies, or of course, if you'd like to find out more about the Sword Association's other events or further business support, then visit www.swordassociation.org. And I'd just like to remind you that we will be able to send you all a copy of the presentation if you'd like to recap on that after we've closed. If you would be kind enough to complete our very short evaluation on exit, we'd be extremely grateful. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us this afternoon, and do have a good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.